to our panel, Sacramental Life and Challenges of Healing. Our first panelist tonight will be Bruce Morrill, the Edward Malloy Chair in Roman Catholic Studies at Vanderbilt University in Nashville. He specializes in sacramental liturgical theology, drawing upon a range of interdisciplinary resources in the fields of systematic and historical theology, ritual studies, cultural anthropology, and biblical studies. His other strongly related interest is in political theologies, investigating the problems of suffering and social contexts. His work has come together most comprehensively in his books, Practical Sacramental Theology at the Intersection of Liturgy and Ethics, Divine Worship and Human Healing, Liturgical Theology at the Margins of Life and Death, and Anamnesis as Dangerous Memory, Political and Liturgical Theology in Dialogue. Other titles include Encountering Christ in the Eucharist, The Paschal Mystery in People, Word, and Sacrament, and The Essential Writings of Bernard Cook, A Narrative Theology of Church, Sacrament, and Ministry, plus 5 edited volumes. His current research and writing projects include a typology of liturgical remembering and a mystical political theology of Easter. A Jesuit priest, his academic degrees include an MA in anthropology from Columbia University and a PhD in religion from Emory University. He's lectured widely in North America, Europe, and Australia, and is the past president of the North American Academy of Liturgy. Our second speaker will be J.J. Wright. Dr. J.J. Wright recently completed his DMA in conducting from the University of Notre Dame's program in sacred music. During his final year in the program, his studies brought him to Rome, where he researched and wrote his dissertation on translating the early Baroque oratorio to jazz. In addition, he studied at the Pontifical Institute of Sacred Music and interned with the Sistine Chapel Choir. JJ also released O Emmanuel, an album for Advent and Christmas with the Notre Dame Children's Choir, which debuted at #1 on the Billboard Classical charts. His latest album, Vespers for the Feast of Transfiguration, is a participatory jazz Vespers service that incorporates improvisation and popular music with congregational singing. The service was recorded and filmed live at St. Peter's Church in New York City as part of their Jazz Vespers series. The accompanying documentary film will air this summer on Catholic TV and Salt and Light TV. Our final panelist will be Dr. Kim Belcher, who is the Associate Professor of Theology at Notre Dame, where she specializes in liturgy and sacramental theology. After getting a bachelor's degree in math and chemistry at the University of Florida, she did her doctoral work at Notre Dame. Her most recent book is Eucharist and Receptive Ecumenism, From Thanksgiving to Communion. Her current research focuses on the impacts of ritual practice and healing from crisis. She has 3 children and teaches the 5th and 6th grade catechesis class at St. Joseph Parish in South Bend. I'll now turn it over to our speakers.
Thank you so much. My task is to spend some time speaking to the ways in which the official sacramental system in the Roman Catholic Church, the ritual system, helps exacerbate and sustain many of the problems concerning assault, abuse, cover up, all of this, yes. And I'm going to do it mostly by looking at some official texts and situate this in the time frame that began, if we just stop to think about it, maybe it's already been mentioned, it was the 1980s, right? That situation in Louisiana and then up in Minnesota that these came to light. And of course, it's only when we get to 2002, January of 2002, that what the Boston Globe investigative team did was able to bring this right to this, what we know, right, this national attention. I just mentioned that framework because the first document I'm going to briefly speak about was issued in 1997. And I think it's notable where it fits in the framework. And then the other two date 2003 and 2004. And so that would follow from when everything really got attention from 2002. And the rhetoric I most want to focus on, because it's there, is the rhetoric of abuse. So with the Catholic laity and wider public demanding an official response, the church hierarchy could no longer avoid public language of abuse associated with the church as of January of 2002. The discourse intensified, of course, over the ensuing couple of years. There is great power, is there not, inherent, to state the obvious, in rhetoric and fraught with symbolism. In fact, no doubt knowing such, the Vatican itself had already issued before and continued to issue after 2002 documents of variable genres and levels of authority condemning and demanding correction to, and these are all specific terms in the documents, abusive and disciplinary irregularity, abusive practices, abuses of role and identity, dangerous abuses, and even singling some cases out as grave abuse. These documents, however, are narrowly concerned with the ministry to and practice of the sacred liturgy, the doctrinal and even dogmatic theology of such, as well as the implications for the entire life and health of the church. So I'm going to briefly examine them for the force and implication of their rhetoric of abuse, hoping this not be found a cynical exercise, but rather an honest attempt to explore one line of official ecclesial reasoning and culture and instruction that might shed some light on why things happened as they did, or how they could have persisted as they did, and to promote really, propose what might be done differently. Yes. Kim is good at teaching and arguing that we have to really get at what's really wrong, right? If we're going to get at what we want to do right. So the first of these is a document that some of you may recall if you're my age or older. 1997, fall of 1997, some questions regarding the collaboration of non-ordained faithful in the priest's sacred ministry. Some questions regarding collaboration of non-ordained faithful, it's a negative definition, in priest's sacred ministry, which was issued by a combination of 8 dicasteries in the Vatican, finished for 15th of August, but only issued in November. And of course, I'm working from the English translation from Origins. Now, legitimate concern for ecclesial communion certainly is important and should be safeguarded. But they press these dicasteries, Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, one for worship and the sacraments, many others. They're concerned about the nature and mission of sacred ministry and the vocation and secular character of the lay faithful. So I may be carrying coals to Newcastle here to you, insofar as we're all aware of clericalism, but we may not be aware of just how it functions inside that world, you know, the people who read this. Now, failures to keep those two distinct, the nature and mission, there's nature and there's mission to sacred ministry, there's vocation and character, secular character of lay faithful. Failure to do this causes true ecclesial communion to be damaged. So what's damaging the unity of the church, or what can damage the unity of the church, is this failure to recognize your proper places. The laity collaborate with the church, but must never be understood as substituting for them. I guess I'll throw in a little personal note. In 1997, I was in my second beginning my second year of teaching at Boston College, where I went to teach theology right after I finished my doctorate, and did a lot of teaching for their Pastoral and Ministry Institute. And so when this thing came out, it became very front page in all of our courses. Yeah. So the laity to collaborate, and that's a really recurrent concern throughout the document. Understand it's collaboration, never substitution. And indeed, the document elsewhere puts in an explanatory note to state that the instruction is meant to encourage vocations, obviously to the priesthood and clerical state, while helping the laity understand that between the ordained and the lay states exists a fundamental equality and difference, teaching them the distinction between function and here's the important term, ontological configuration. Yes? So there is, and this is where the language goes, great danger in reducing sacred ministry to functions, thereby losing the ontologically distinct orders of bishop, priest, and deacon to the effect of abandoning the very sacramental nature of the church itself. I don't know if you're picking up on this. I mean, it comes off so dry, you know, but they're worried. And you know, it's, yeah, you get it. If you're laughing, you get it. So, this is being recorded. Viewing things otherwise, quoting again, viewing things otherwise risks interpreting service in the church as an exercise of power. So for lay people to not understand their distinct status, let alone to usurp it by thinking themselves as substitutes, is an abusive exercise and a power grab. How does that not amount, my question, not theirs, to the 8 Vatican Archbishop dicasteries accusing members of the laity of trying to grab power or overtake the church? But therein lies the rub, right? How can sacraments and ministry not be exercises of power? That's my question. Of course they are, right? And here the document shows slippage in its rhetoric of service. So how does it do that? Well, it expounds upon, maybe extol would not be an exaggeration, the servant nature of the ministerial priesthood. But further along, the instruction describes, quote, undue lay aspiration to the ordained ministry, end quote, an ambiguous advancement of the laity, end quote. And to my reading, it may not be an adequate one, and obviously my hermeneutic is one of suspicion on steroids, but that seems quite contradictory. If you spend articles or paragraphs extolling how this is all about being a servant priest, or the priesthood's a servant thing, but then why would anybody be aspiring to this or to advance? Then you're advancing the laity. The laity should not try to advance themselves, but they be wanting to advance themselves to be servants. To me, the rhetoric breaks down when I work within the document internally. Be that as it may, I write more pleasantly than I talk. The Vatican argues that all of this danger to the very nature of the church occurs practically through abuses for which the 8 dicasteries set forth the corrected norms. Now, what are abuses? The term is defined helpfully in the document. Disciplinary irregularity in pastoral practice. That's abuse. Elsewhere, improper practices which have become widespread in some places. Mm-hmm. Okay, so if that helps you, because I often want abuse, what are you talking about here? Communion, and to my mind, as I read it, the concern isn't so much unity as uniformity, must come through adherence to, quote, truth, justice, peace, and charity, which are all interdependent terms, end quote. So Article 1 concerns strictly appropriate terminology. No non-ordained person, this is how people are defined, is to have such titles as pastor, chaplain, coordinator, moderator, which I can remember set up a lot of trouble for, or I guess made new work for people that make nameplates, right? Because you'd have, the office of the college chaplain. I remember I'm an alumnus of a different Holy Cross, the one in Massachusetts. And by then, for 10 years, the college chaplain was a woman. And so they had to do all this gymnastics and say now she was the director of chaplaincies or something, you see? But it's that kind of, it sounds trite, but it's powerful, right? Yeah. And this harkens back to another section where in precision and terminology about the ministry protects against an implied creeping from, and this is the classic stuff from order, or the sacrament of order. You don't want any creeping from munera to officia. You don't want to have any movement from what you've received in ordination being pushed over into office, etc. So my conclusion, the dicasteries are at pains to convince the laity that the ordained are not over and above them, but servants. But this assumes rightly that most of the church, clergy and laity, hold that very much is their attitude. Otherwise, you don't need to produce a document like that, making those apologetic statements repeatedly. More than distinctions and complementarity at work here, such that the sexually assaulted would regularly explain, and this was the painful stuff for me and to read and hear in 2002 throughout the year, such things as we were taught that the priest is Christ here on earth. To what extent have the laity participated in this willingly even? Not so much in recent decades, right? The time now that we're living in, but to be catechized into this, not with this very technical language I just did at you, but in the way that would be presented by teachers, religious teachers in schools, the sisters and stuff, who very often only had it in a more colloquial way themselves, yeah? And especially, and this shows up in other documents, which I wouldn't have the time to do with you, but persistently, this identification of the hands of the priest as being uniquely sacred, yes? Which then haunts one when one hears accounts of the assaults and so forth that are done, yes? But also explain some of it, right? Why? Well, why didn't you say anything or whatever? Well, or why weren't you questioning? Of course, if it's a young person anyway, they're dumbfounded. But my point would be, that's all in the culture of it. And it's actually made me, I don't get to ordinations very often, but the last time I was at one, the triumphalism, it's just something that hit me in a whole new way. But also in the ritual itself, Roman Catholic ordination of priesthood, how much made of this, of hands and so forth. And how much of it focuses especially, to keep the medieval gesture that like a key gesture is to place a chalice and paten in those hands. And the clericalism can get reinforced. It makes better sense to me why increasing numbers of people in greater Nashville, where I help out in parishes, prefer again not to do the 4th century, present your hands as a throne to receive communion, but their hands shouldn't touch it. I'm a baby boomer, but the late end. So I missed a lot of this, the hyper version of that, but now I understand it better from this. Okay, time. I'm going to skip there. John Paul II in 2003 for Holy Thursday did not only issue the customary letter or apostolic letter on Holy Thursday, which is always written to the priests of the world. So this is an ecclesiology that understands that on the cusp of his execution, Jesus ordained these apostles, that he founded the priesthood. But in certain years, Paul VI did it once also, an encyclical instead, and on the Eucharist. It makes a lot of a concept which has remained important and debated, but also, well, this concept of in persona Christi, very troubling, because the concept historically and the way it functions in the Latin is you're doing something in the name of someone. But because of that very word persona, it's morphed over time into somehow the person, and so you get these doggone arguments, like why a woman can't be a priest or something, because, well, she can't in persona Christi. And that's a bit glib, of course, at best, but what I'm trying to say is I'm noticing in the documents that this is what they're not dumb. They're going hard on this, right? They've got to protect this stuff. But what John Paul does at the end of the document, there's a lot of beautiful stuff in there. And I don't mean that as a pandering statement. I mean, whoever helped him write it, a lot of the doctrinal stuff is very good. But the promissory note at the end of the document in 2003 is that for next Holy Thursday in 2004 will come a disciplinary document. And that's the document called Redemptionis Sacramentum, March 25th, 2004, Cardinal Arinze, prefect of that office. And yeah, this one set me flat back in my chair as I was reading it on screen. Why? Because I was starting to keep track as I went through, but it totals some 27 abuses that are expounded upon throughout the document. How the Eucharist is being abused, or that the celebration of the Mass is being abused. And to me, it just seemed utterly tone deaf at best. Like, how can you do this in 2004? Yeah. And to see it, grave matters, abuses, grave abuses, irregularities to be reprobated, remedies and gravior delicta. Our speaker last night, first speaker, was speaking about this, what delicts are and so forth. So again, because of time, I just want to point out that these things include, I'll just give one example. You can imagine what many of them are. And they include such things as the grave delict of a priest receiving, the presiding priest receiving communion after all the other people have received it is hereby abrogated. And that's what I'd been doing. It was kind of how I was trained at the Jesuit School of Theology in Berkeley. And I mean, really, yay. And yeah, I mean, and that's for me, again, the servant rhetoric goes, it's all just blather. It's just hot air, right? Because if you're really going to demonstrate, what kind of table manners is it when you've set up all this stuff in this disciplinary document about this role, this unique role, and all of this that this priest presider is doing, because you can't say celebrant anymore. And then you just like blow up the notion that one would not stand in front of everybody and self-communicate. Oh, and they added the rules in the ensuing missal, right? That no lay persons to approach the altar of sacrifice until the priest is completely consumed. And when I was still in Georgia doing my doctorate, they'd set up tray tables like we used to set up when you watch TV in front of the, watch TV and you eat. They set, so they didn't even enter the presbyterium anymore. And then the cups and stuff were, so, I'm pulling at some low hanging fruit there probably. But the question is sacrality finally, and I'll stop on this note for now. It seems to me that there's, and again, this is maybe stating the obvious, but there's false sacrality, and then there's that which hopefully has an evangelical character. And it's a false sacrality to say what's going to save the church and keep it from not being in unity is this distinction, even as they're saying it's servant leadership, but actually you are not to usurp or even try to be as a lay person ambition to what the priest is. And then symbolically, to have the priest have to receive first and then stand there in silence and have his own pious reception of the Eucharist and move on. What I observe in Nashville, where I helped at the parish a lot, it finally started to make sense how people also get the sense that they just walk up and grab and go, right? The whole choreography is inverted. So we're not sharing at a table. And the res tantum, I may have done it at Berkeley, but I know my my stuff, okay, my Aquinas and Augustine in the doctrine of the church, that the res tantum, the ultimate reality of the Eucharist, is to bond the members more as the body of Christ, right? That's the thing I don't hear anywhere in any of this. And instead, it's this kind of just, and of course that sets up a culture which may feed into so much of what's been discussed in these days and will tomorrow. So there, yeah.
Well, thanks, Bruce. So I'm following. Can you hear me? Okay. I'm following Bruce today, but coming at it from a completely different angle, I think. And I hope to present to you today a little bit more of a case study based on the work that I've been doing with the folk choir here at Notre Dame. And but very relevant to our keynote panel title today, Sacramental Life and the Challenges of Healing. So I'm just going to talk chronologically here and hopefully fill in the gaps as we go. But about 3 years ago, I was commissioned by the Notre Dame Children's Choir, which is a children's choral institution here on campus, to create a passion. So a telling of the story of Jesus's death from Holy Thursday through the crucifixion and the burial. And the real impetus here with the director there, Dr. Mark Dories, he was interested in helping cultivate some kind of environment for the young people in the choir, ages like 11 to 14 or so, to talk about hard things. So the passion kind of naturally presented itself as the lens to be able to talk about hard things through. Now, at the same time, Notre Dame had presented, the university had presented their forum topic for that year, which was the clergy sexual abuse crisis. And for me, as a composer of sacred music, one of the first things that I have to be able to do when I'm going to write music about a topic is kind of figure out what it has to do with my own relationship with God, of course, but then figure out where that relationship is going to change as a result of the creative work. And so as I started to kind of get into the passion, the first thing I noticed was that I have no desire to think about the passion, which to me was really striking because, you know, as a good Christian, I wanted to present to the students of the folk choir kind of the bread and butter of what it might mean to practice your faith in 2021 or 2022. So passion, resurrection seem like they're kind of right down the center. But the problem was that I had no desire. And so kind of in noticing that this was a difficult topic to even look at. So kind of this abstraction, this is historical abstraction of Jesus's suffering and death, started to resonate with me kind of along the same lines as some of the questions that people were asking about the clergy sexual abuse crisis. So in that year, the university was asking, how do we engage our students, especially young people who are going to walk out into the unbubbled church, so away from Notre Dame, of course, and be able to encounter honestly or in an integrated way the reality of a church that has been decimated by this crisis. So fast forward a little bit, we started with the children's choir. COVID also happened that year, and but as a result, we pivoted a great bit. We had written the whole thing. Actually, my collaborator on the project, Tristan Cooley, is here sitting in the back. Is a wonderful poet and librettist, and so we worked on this project from the ground up. But the wonderful thing that happened as a result of COVID was that we had an opportunity to bring the undergraduate students into the conversation about the piece in a very direct way. And to really my sort of naive surprise, I guess, they didn't want to talk about the clergy sexual abuse crisis either. I figured, you know, like if I bring this stuff up, maybe this could be a way to, you know, in this really safe community, this place where students are eager to ask questions about their faith, perhaps this could be an environment where we could start to ask some questions about the clergy sexual abuse crisis. Now, like I said, it didn't really kind of go according to plan, but what we found out instead was by engaging the students creatively with the scriptures themselves. Okay, so it's a very kind of Ignatian process based, placing ourselves in the scriptural scenes and asking ourselves to view the scenes from different perspectives of different characters within the Passion, and then to kind of invite ourselves to bring the things that aren't going right about our lives into the scene. Okay, so Peter is a great scene, right? Because Peter betrays his best friend, right? He pretends like he doesn't know his friend, and this resonates greatly when you think about the ways that we both discovered the clergy sexual abuse crisis and the nature of it, but also the way that for students at least, this connects with many of the things that are happening on a day-to-day basis in their lives that are just like a difficult thing to talk about, right? This friend, they didn't stand up for me when I needed help, or et cetera, et cetera. So we were able to survey the students and really engage in some great conversations with them. But the real gem of the whole project started to come out when we asked students to write poetry and music based on the way they were encountering the scripture. And so I'm trying to kind of capture these three different buckets, and maybe I'll eventually be able to get there. But we have this sense of like placing ourselves in the presence of Jesus through the scriptures in small groups. Okay, so we have this reality. And then we have this other reality of like, those things that are going on in my life that I think have nothing to do with faith might actually be tied into this other thing somehow, but we don't quite know how yet. Okay, and then the third thing is this sort of creative pursuit. And the creative pursuit is, let's not worry too much about the form that my ideas take, but maybe just kind of put it into a melody or put it into a stanza of poetry and see what happens. Now, the incredible thing that started to happen, of course, for any of our creatives in the audience, you know that this is like a summary of the creative process, of course. But for our students, it became a really wonderful way to engage them in like holistically. And I say holistically because I think what's important, or what I've learned at least from engaging on this project with the students, is that they're seeking, just like us, to find meaning with their whole selves in their faith. Okay, so we're very privileged here at Notre Dame with 85% of our students being Catholic according to the survey, and albeit we have about 35% of students who regularly participate in religious activity on campus. So according to the survey, so 85% of our students are Catholic, and then between 30 and 40% participate regularly in some kind of religious activity. Regularly is defined by once per month. So what is kind of emerged here has been this patchwork, I guess is a good way to put it, of melodies, words that all go along and tell the story of the Passion from the beginning to the end. And connecting it kind of a little bit to the title of the conference, Accountability, Healing, and Trust. One of the questions that we asked frequently kind of in the earlier stage of the project was, there's a notion of shared responsibility that came up a lot during this forum year, shared responsibility. And this idea resonated with me a lot, and I connected with it because what does it mean to be accountable to something that you're not directly responsible for? Okay, so for young people who are Catholic and who are going to leave Notre Dame, how do they walk into a church and say, it's my responsibility to be accountable to this thing that I have nothing to do with? Now, of course, this is something things, but the hope here at least is that with an issue as awful as clergy sexual abuse, can we Notre Dame, they're not just completely smashed over the head by the reality of this. Now, the other thing I noticed was we have accountability, healing, and trust. And I think that if this was sequential, healing would have to come after trust. So accountability, trust, and then healing, perhaps. The idea of healing, I think, is a really difficult idea because in order for something to be healed, we have to acknowledge that it exists. And I think as a church, especially the people I know in the church, at least, we're not even really close to acknowledging the fact that this has existed. We don't even really know. I mean, we're getting better because we're starting to understand better, like the scope of how many people have abused and the people who have been abused. But I would argue that we're really just scratching the surface of understanding this better. In order for there to be any sense of trust or healing, especially, I think the original issue kind of needs to be brought to light, and there has to be some understanding of responsibility and who needs to take that. The tomorrow evening we'll present our passion, and this is I think you guys heard one of the songs from it last night at prayer if you were there for evening prayer, and it's called the Last Supper song. And one of the questions that we also asked as we wrote the Passion was, as a liturgical choir, which the folk choir is, our main thing is to sing at Mass every Sunday in the Basilica. What does the Passion have to do with this kind of office that we hold? I don't know if we're allowed to say that, are we? Yeah, you're right. Okay, we're not chaplains, but yes. And the beautiful thing, of course, about the Passion is that we get to memorialize this event every time we go to the Eucharist. And we think that one of the ways that we can learn to sort of behold, if you will, the clergy sexual abuse crisis is by learning to see it through Christ's suffering and death and resurrection. We haven't gotten quite yet to the resurrection part in our own imaginations, but if we're able to sort of contemplate the difficulty of the Passion, to me, there's hope in being able to see that even though we have a great trial and a great difficulty in front of us with learning to face the clergy sexual abuse crisis, there's a bigger thing that we're a part of. I think Kim said it great the other day, like, the God is king of, or Jesus is king of all the universe, right? So, there's much bigger questions kind of at play, but yeah, we'll kind of stop there. Yeah.
I'm going to stand because it's easier for me to teach when I'm standing up. So I actually want to try to synthesize the thematics of this panel, but I'm going to start in a totally third space, from Bruce's historical and theoretical remarks on rhetoric, and from JJ's case study on what it looks like to work intergenerationally on the memory of sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. I want to start by kind of broadening and also specifying the account we're giving of harm. Because I work in liturgy, I work in ritual, And that means working with the symbolic. And sometimes our account of anthropology makes it hard to see the connections between liturgy and the bodies and souls and minds of people who have been abused. And I actually think I said I wasn't going to get to the synthetic right away, but I guess I did. But I actually think that that distancing of the symbolic world of liturgy from the bodies and minds and souls of the body of Christ who have been abused is part of the problem. Maybe even a really big part of the problem. Maybe even, an obfuscation, a distraction that's, going to be a continuing part of the problem. So when we think about the harms that have been described, which so many of you can describe better than I can in this conference, but the harms to the bodies and the minds and the relational capacities of survivors of abuse. One of the things that happens is what David called narrative collapse. Another way of thinking about narrative collapse is a collapse of the symbolic world that we live in. The symbolic world is what tells us what the connections are between ourselves, our body, the others around us, our community, the created world we live in, and God. And when we have someone who has been presented within the church as a stand-in for God, for Christ, who then is revealed to be an abuser, it's not only the survivor's symbolic world that collapses, it's everybody's symbolic world that hears that testimony, which is why so many people react with indignation, anger, and disbelief. Because it's actually harder in some ways if you're not the survivor. It's so hard if you are. But if you're not the survivor and you're working on secondhand data, and that secondhand data threatens your whole symbolic world, nothing makes sense. So that's actually what I want to talk about. And then, what is the role of ritual in rebuilding the symbolic relationships that allow us to make sense of our world, not just survivors, I almost want to say, but the whole community with survivors. I'm sorry. How do we reintegrate this? Okay, so I've taken a pattern from ritual studies in the kind of what do we see in the process of social crisis in a community, and then what's the role of ritual within that social crisis. And then I was worried that I was going to be too abstract, and I should have made you all a diagram, and I didn't. So instead, I've made you a scriptural mnemonic. So I'm going to go through the 5 stages of the social crisis, and with a scriptural mnemonic that's taken from the raising of Lazarus in John 11. So this is not an interpretation of Lazarus. It's not exactly. It's just a helpful, I think, handrail so you can remember it. So the first one is the breach or the wrongdoing, the thing that was the harm, the damage. The phrase of Jesus is that I'm going to associate with each stage of the mnemonic. This one is Lazarus is dead. So he tells this to the disciples when he's still far away. He says Lazarus is dead. Lazarus is dead. When Jesus arrives on the tomb, though, he's locked up in a tomb. Which means that kind of the damage is kind of contained, right? It's been contained in a tomb. So this is actually the situation of survivors, is that they are holding, they're containing. When we were not talking about this, when we are not talking about this, we're asking survivors' bodies and symbolic worlds to sustain all the damage that's been done by all of this wrongdoing. So then the next stage, that's just kind of that is the wrong. The first stage of the process of social crisis is actually exposure. The wrong has to be exposed before anything can be done. And we're still working on that stage. And we'll probably be working on it a long time. We'll maybe always be working on it. I'll get to that in a minute. My scriptural mnemonic for this is when Jesus says, take away the stone. And Martha says, Lord, by now there'll be a stench. In other words, we don't want to deal with it. It's this whole thing that you were saying about, I don't want to look at it. And so the problem with the problem of exposure, like exposure is a necessary part of the process, but exposure is the point when the survivor's pain is shared to the whole community, which lessens the pain for them, but makes everybody else feel like it's a new damage. And I think that's what one of the things we keep seeing is we keep going into this cycle of like, if we can just shut this down, then, you know, there won't be a problem. It won't go forward. We'll keep our children safe in the future. Nothing else will go wrong. Everything will be fine. But that's really just asking these people to continue holding a pain that belongs to the whole body. So many people have said this better than I have already today. So the taking away the stone is like kind of this first step, and a lot of times we're very focused on that. I mean, it is a really essential part of the problem. And that's where, you know, I'm trying to think about some of the things I've heard, you know, where we feel like our only choice is a cover up or prosecution. But what we need is actually exposure, the sharing of pain. There are a lot of ways that can be done. Some of them are ritual. Not all of them are ritual. I would say probably none of them are going to really look like Catholic Mass, which unfortunately is really what our ministers know how to do. So that's an issue. And so that's part of in fact, the Mass is actually like going to continue to exacerbate that distance between the false sacrality and the dignity of our people. In a lot of ways, that's how we experience it, which is why, you know, Annie Selleck has written about this so beautifully, that the Mass can be really re-traumatizing for survivors, something important that should be said in the conference. But then we get to a part that actually I think Western culture is not good at, which is like, we want to study the problem and have a destination before we even start out on a journey. Like we want, you know, Google Maps. Crisis does not work like Google Maps, because there is no kind of all-knowing human person that can look down and say, this is the right road and everyone who takes this road will get there. That's not how a social crisis works, and it's not how trauma works. And so obviously it's not how ritual is going to help us either. But there are kinds of what I would call the phase of diagnosis. And I think those of us that are here in the room are here because we're interested in diagnosis. We're also interested in like critical care, but diagnosis is part of critical care. And so when we look at other cultures where ritual is like a more universal form of thinking than it is in our Western, kind of especially in the academy, we see that this phase of diagnosis is a phase where we offer really big symbols, big narratives, and a lot of space and a lot of silence. So when I think about this, I think about kind of what we've seen intergenerationally with Holocaust memorials and ritualizations. The first generation of Holocaust survivors are not usually really interested in Holocaust memorials, or often in talking about what has happened to them. It's too close, and they don't want to. And one of the things that's interesting about a memorial as a ritual structure, if you'll allow me, is that a memorial is a space. It's a spatial designation which allows for movement. You can go as close as you want. You can stay away. That gives a survivor agency. If the agency we grant them is to stay away from the memorial of what's happened to them, that is actually a type of healing and a type of redress that's being offered. So I think that's actually, space is one way ritually how that we can, as a community, try to diagnose the problem, and also move on to the next phase of redress. And one of the things you're going to see is that because people enter into this problem at different places, something we've already heard a lot about at this conference, our young people are falling into the problem. We might be really caught up in, diagnosis, redress. By the way, my diagnosis thing is Lazarus, come out, because then you can see the bindings on his hands and feet. And then Jesus says, unbind him. That's redress. So when we have people who come to a problem that's already a ship in sail, they come in at that first stage and they don't really, for them, it's a new breach. If they come into your classroom and no one has ever let them talk about, or they've only heard adult whispers overhead about sexual abuse, then it comes as a fresh traumatic revelation for them. And that, I think, is really important to remember. We are going to be always ritualizing all of these stages over and over, because we're going to have people entering into this process at different places. So when we think about redress in ritual, one of the most effective forms of redress is the reversal of symbolic damage. So when you have people who have been traumatized by priests being put on a pedestal, for example, the anointed hands, this is one of the reasons why all of the presiders of our liturgies at this conference are lay presiders. It's a symbolic reversal of the damage that we're trying to redress. So similarly, what I've seen kind of watching JJ with the folk choir is, if I expect conducting to kind of mostly be a one-way authority exercise. And JJ has really taken the opposite. He has symbolically reversed that in his work with the folk choir, in inviting them into the process of composition, in tearing or letting go of a piece that he had fully constructed, in order to make space for their insights and their creativity to enter in to the process. So I think that's when we think about redress, it's really, really important to think about what are the ways that damage has been done to this person's symbolic world, these people's symbolic world, this community's symbolic world. And then we have to reverse that damage. To get back to these kind of regulations about the liturgy, one of the things that we really see here is kind of a doubling down on the notion that what's really matters is precision, distinction, hierarchy, power, and top-down relationality, which means that if we want to try to redress that, we're going to have to do things the thing is, our laity are now conditioned to this. They really expect that liturgy means that you're going to have to be super precise and you're going to do the same thing. And there are a lot of really complicated rules that they can't be expected to keep straight. So it's important to listen to Father and maybe the lay ministers. And I think that we're going to have to actually allow people to get it wrong. So I guess this is your one chance to hear a liturgist telling you to do liturgy wrong. I think it's really important right now for people to realize that we can do things together and get it wrong and recover as a community. And the liturgy is despite the fact that I'm a liturgist, a relatively low stakes but high symbolic environment for us to get it wrong together. So I always feel like, you know, you don't learn anything until you get it wrong. So so get it wrong as a first step towards getting it right.
We'll now open up the floor for questions. So we have a microphone right here. So if you have a question, feel free to just come up.
Not a question, but I just wanted to affirm something that you said in terms of the experience from the congregation of worship. When I was finishing my canon law degree, we went over to visit the various dicasteries. And when we went into the congregation for whatever it was called at that time, because it keeps changing names, we actually met with whoever was the cardinal that was in charge of the congregation. And I don't remember who it was, so I'm not trying to throw anybody under the bus. But essentially what we said, what does the congregation do? And what he did was recite a series of awful abuses. I mean, it was like he had this list in front of him, you know, in one place, you know, the priest presided as an Easter rabbit at the Easter Mass, and in another place, I mean, he just went through this whole thing. And it was shocking to know that that kind of stuff was going on, because that's not what we thought was going on in the church, right? And then I said, so that's really interesting, and it's good to hear all that. Can you tell us what positively is going on? Can you tell us what is happening in liturgy that's positive that the congregation knows about? And my interpretation is he couldn't, because what he did was give us another new list of abuses. That's all he talked about in the hour and a half that we were with him, was the awful things that were happening in liturgy.
This is actually just a really quick clarifying question, Kim. I think I missed the 5th step of the mnemonic.
Oh, you know what?
What's
You
the
didn't
5th
miss
step
it.
of
I
the
forgot to get to it. So thanks. So it's either reintegration or schism. And I have that associated with let him go in my mnemonic. A lot of people this is the only place they want ritual to enter into a healing process, which is why I think this is actually also, I think, why people don't like the language of crisis, because they think crisis is like, they don't realize that like it's a long process. Crisis is not like, you know, something that's short-lived. It's a generational trauma that's going to take at least a generation, but usually a couple generations.
Go through all of them because I lost it by number.
Yeah, it's fine. I really tried to, this was probably a bad choice in the beginning. The first one is damage, and I used Lazarus is dead. And the second one is exposure, and I used take away the stone. Diagnosis, Lazarus come out. Redress, unbind him. And reintegration, let him go. Now, I think it's important to note, like most effective rituals are going to have more than one, because people are at different stages in this process. So they're going to have more, they're going to be also performing multiple stages of what's happening. So, so movement through space and, you know, symbolic reversal, you can have those and still be doing exposure and the other things at the same time.
I appreciated the different foci that you used in this panel. And I wanted to start with a comment when you were talking, Bruce, when you were talking about those pronouncements of abuses that came out. I remembered when the 2004 one came out that included no lay people shall preach at Sunday liturgies. And I was running the homiletics department at a regional seminary at that point. And I had been preaching for 20 years. We thought, okay, but that couldn't possibly mean where a lay preacher was the only one who could speak the language of the congregation. It couldn't mean that. Oh, yeah, they did. Later, it came down through our diocesan bishop. You shall not preach, even if it means the congregation won't hear a homily. Yep. Okay, then. And so, obviously, that was not pleasant, right? Had to learn a whole new theological discipline. They didn't fire me, but how can you teach something you're not allowed to do? Right. Okay. Anyway, but what I then was Kim, your use of the Lazarus story was beautifully homiletic. And it made me, because just expanding the imagination, because what fear does is it constricts the imagination. And what we need now is to engage fear far enough so we can expand the imagination. And I think like pointing to ritual. And then my question, I guess, though, is, okay, new rituals, yes. Bringing back the voices of people who have been shut down, absolutely. How? Catholics, Mass. And then you have other rituals and you get your 12 people, right? But do you have ideas about how to inspire the imagination of the faithful, especially around scary stuff, which might cause more naturally a constriction rather than an expansion?
Thanks. I would say I look forward to tomorrow evening. That's my own gut reaction. That as I listened to JJ, and was just winding down from having to do my piece, and realizing what a remarkable contrast that your work is one in which you want people to enter into it and be creative, right? Versus even the testimony from our colleague, go over to visit those offices and all they can do is, out of their fear, talk about abuse, right? Because they're so fearful for their power, right? So I would just say it's not going to be. And I agree with Kim and yourself that the challenge is great, because certainly since the late 60s, the only kind of ritual that comes to mind is Mass for Catholics. And we could go into reasons and all that kind of stuff, but so there is the fact, right? So I've presided at baptisms where people say immediately after, that was a really nice Mass, Father. There's no Mass of the baptism. So it tells you a lot, right? But it's going to have to, I think, so often come through these creative loci. And the beautiful thing is when people are doing and putting so much work into performing and bringing some new artistic creation or umpteenth interpretation of Pippin or whatever, people do turn up for that. So that's my hopeful note. It's extra liturgical, if by liturgy we mean that stuff.
Mass.
Probably exists.
Yeah, I guess the other thing that's so interesting about creativity, to me at least, is that it shows us how to think in a new way. So getting the chance to like re-enter into the creative process is basically just challenging the premise of it creates a pathway for us to be able to look at something that was previously blocking. The other way I think about this with music, at least, is like I like to say that like music it doesn't really bypass the intellect necessarily, but it can sneak around it sometimes, right? Just like a great conversation can, right? It can stir your heart in such a way so as to spur us to a new thought that we didn't know existed yet. And I think that's the part of this particular issue, because the way I want to expand on it a little bit is just to say, like, my encounter with the Passion was really through this lens of the clergy sexual abuse crisis. When we brought this to the students and kind of showed them what we were doing, showed them how we were thinking about this, their first reaction was, whoa, like what if we thought about the way women are involved in leadership in the church through this same lens? Or what if we thought about climate change through this same lens? Or what if we talked about racial injustice through these same lenses? And I think that's the real promise of the Passion, from my perspective at least, is that it opens up these new pathways for us to consider what our role and responsibility is going forward. It brings us back to that question, of course, like, how do I learn how to be accountable for things that I did not create, for problems I did not create? But
Yeah, I just want to say, with regard to your comment about the Lazarus story, that one of the reasons I think this is effective is because with Lazarus too, don't we think of it as like this instantaneous thing? Like we just think, oh, it's just like that and he's healed, but there's all these stages in the story. I mean, it's that we just want to gloss over and go straight to the end where he's like living and walking around again. So it's like how we struggle with crisis in that way. Yeah. So with regard to the other thing, I actually have become comfortable making a liturgy for 12 people, and just I'm fine with that. So, but I mean, you know, it does require a reaccounting of what is valuable about putting together a liturgy. But to me, like, that's probably about what we had at morning prayer today. I was pretty happy. I loved it. So, and it went wrong. So that in my book, that means it was good, right?
successful.
Thank you so much for the excellent panel. I learned a lot. Dr. Belcher, you made a remark that I absolutely loved, where very insightful, explaining how the collapse of the symbolic world, very helpful framework for explaining a number of things, but in particular explaining why that disposes so many people in a community to be incredulous and defensive in processes of exposure. I will, for one, just flag that there are a number of trauma theorists. There's an edited volume by Jeffrey Kaufman on the loss of the assumptive world that uses a very similar framework to understanding traumatic loss, generally speaking. So one, just gratitude for using that as a lens for potentially explaining why are people so defensive and resistant. The question that I have based on that is that if that is true, and I think you're right, that seems to at least give some credence to the idea that community members who are exposed to the truth of sexual abuse around them might be actually experiencing a vicarious traumatization, where they are, again, they are affected in a genuinely traumatic, if in fact it is a collapse of a symbolic world around them, that is its own form of trauma. So that is a conclusion that I'm wrestling with. So interested to hear your thoughts. And then the related question to that is, if that is true, how do we prevent that vicarious traumatization from usurping the central attention on the survivors themselves? Because I think we can agree, we don't want things to go that direction.
Yeah, thanks. And I was trying to avoid that language for exactly the reason that you brought up right at the end there, that we don't want, even if the whole community suffers, primarily they suffer in solidarity with the suffering member, you know, and ideally, not saying they actually do. I think actually though they don't, right? They react as if they've been wounded. And this is something that, like, as if it's traumatic to them, even if we want to make a distinction, which I think would be appropriate between that, like primary and secondary. But I mean, I think actually knowing that this is how people react can help us direct better the responses. And actually, I mean, this is such a cliche, but like from your work and from Dr. Scarsell's work, I've actually learned a lot of these concepts. So I think that is something that we need to look out for. There might be ways, so I think this is actually one of the things where the communal character of ritual behavior becomes an assist, because there are ways that when we care ritually for a person that's at the center of a crisis, that care spills over onto their closest caregivers, who generally are sharing in their trauma in some way. And if we're like willing to grant that, then we might be like, and tertiary in a way that's tertiary to the rest of the community. But I think that's a way, and actually, again, I feel like I'm like kind of bibliographing here, and I apologize for it. But Bruce talks about this in a really lovely way in his book, Divine Worship and Human Healing, where he was doing the sacrament of anointing with a community, and the people who primarily, or not primarily, but some of the people who experience healing in that liturgy were close relatives of those who were anointed, not the people who were anointed themselves. Well, I mean, I think they did too, but my point is that when we, and this is something I teach in my classes, so I apologize to those of you who've heard it many times before, but when we do a sacrament in the Catholic Church, the person that we are, or the subject of the sacrament is not just the person who receives the sacrament, it's the whole church. And the church receives the sacrament through that person. So if you think about, I don't want to go into orders, but if you think about anointing in this way, right? That what's suffering when somebody is seriously ill is not just that one person that's seriously ill, but their whole social community. And so if we are healing, we're not just healing the body of that, or the mind, or both of that one person that's suffering, but we're really trying to heal the whole community by attending to this person who's especially suffering. And I think that model might work also for what you're talking about here.
I'm only going to add quickly because I know Jerry has something I want to say, but on that last point, that is what the healing, what we call the healing stories in the four gospels are all about, right? That the healing is not at all just about Jesus biomedically curing an individual. Yeah, it's not at all. So what? Okay, wow, this guy can do it. But rather, so often what has to happen is the conversion. And that's why, who does he say? Why did you say your sins are forgiven rather than you're healed? Who do you think you are? Those are low hanging fruit ones. But the beautiful one in Mark is the father of the boy who keeps going into seizures, right? Because by that time in Mark, we all know that Jesus helped this kid, right? But the father says, Jesus says, this has to be cured by faith. And the man says, do you believe I can do this? The man says, I do believe. And then how to translate the Greek? It's usually very clunky, right? Help me in my unbelief. No, but if you don't do literal translate, that kind of thing, which is lousy, a better translation would be, I do believe and I'm losing it. That's what's going on, right? And that is this beautiful, I think the best of the stories, the other ones, pick your favorite, but that show what Kim was just talking about. And there may be ways, again, creatively, we can come to that. But anyway, Jerry.
Thank you all very much. I mean, this has just been enlivening and really breathtaking. Two very quick questions. Might you all imagine, as sacramentalists and ritualists, a particular day in church, liturgical calendar, when we have a day of lamentation for this horror, and what might that look like, and might that be something to imagine? Secondarily, I give retreats with fellow survivors and to fellow survivors, but what about those whose meaning, whose symbols have been absolutely destroyed by the very realities that have been used against them, when survivors have been abused by priests in their collars, and seeing a collar is a trigger, or crossing the street where church is, that's a trigger, and that hurts. So how do we sort of imagine our own sort of music, of survivors that is just about them without putting anything else on it?
Yeah, that's a great question. The first one, I'm biased, but I think Good Friday is a good day for the acknowledgement to answer your first question. And just to go back to kind of the horrific nature of the Passion story, and there's nothing really. I feel like I keep saying the same thing, but like sitting with the story for a very long time teaches something very important. I think that's related to all the stuff that we're talking about. The second question is a really good question. And I don't have any sense of a good answer there, but I do know that, and Mary's here too, and she knows a lot more than me too, but in getting to speak with some of the survivors that I've spoken with, just about this process and this project, Mary said, we went to dinner not too long ago, and she said, every time I meet with a survivor, I learn something new about God. And so that's probably the best way to say, or that I've heard anyone say, kind of like, what does it mean to maybe just listening is another kind of thing that I think would be really important.
It's a beautiful thought about Good Friday. When we realized that there were these lamentations, right, that have existed since the Middle Ages, and that
Jeremiah.
Yep, and need to be would lend themselves to new creative engagement, and that makes it much more communal than all Jesus did for me, and for that I'm not going to eat candy for 40 days. But that was pejorative, and that's but yeah, that you can build the community. That beautiful point that this Kemi put so nicely, brilliantly, that the sacraments don't happen to individuals. The people, of course, the fundamental sacrament, right? They're the primary sacrament. And that would be an occasion where there may be others, without taking too much time. And it could also be Passion/Palm Sunday, because a lot more people turn out for that. And I've always found, I'll be 30 years a priest this year, that's a hard, I don't preach much that day. And it's not just, oh, this is going to go, it's already long, but rather, what's to be said. Now I'm hearing something's happening in this conversation. Oh, there's something to be said.
The other day I thought it was Our Lady of Sorrows.
Yeah, there's a good one. Yeah. But definitely Lent. Go ahead.
Yeah. I just want to speak to the second question first, actually. For a survivor who is triggered by the church, being able to avoid the church is a kind of agency that is a symbolic reversal of the damage that's been done. So that, not just respecting, but rejoicing in their ability to choose where they will and will not go, I think is something that we are called to, like almost, I will say, compelled to. So I think that's actually quite amazing. And that's, I'm not afraid of that. So, I think that's actually something to be deeply respected. Yeah. About the other, I've been thinking about this, liturgical, ways of lamenting. And I'm just going to add a note of caution. These are great days, so I would, go into that. But one of the things that's hard when you're lamenting a structural sin is you're inevitably gathered as a body of people who are impacted by that sin in different ways. Some of us are hurt by the sin in a primary way. Some of us are hurt by the sin in a secondary way. Some of us have never heard of it before and are just showing up because, our roommate just yesterday told us. And then there are people who are at least privileged by their position and don't actually have to see or show the damage that's been done. And so it actually is an art that I don't think has been written about enough. Maybe I just haven't read the right books, but to kind of to write a liturgy in a way that allows participation from all of these different perspectives, which is one reason why, again, I suggest like put your big symbols out there and then leave freedom of interpretation, space for approach, silence, allow a space. This is what we did with Visio Divina. Visio Divina is really good with this. It gives you just a little bit of space, just enough space to kind of create your interpretive distance that you need from what you've seen. And so I think that's actually really important, is to create a space for engagement that allows like a variety of different perspectives to cohere together. And this is actually what ritual is really good at, is like, we can all do this together and we don't all have to occupy exactly the same perspective like we sometimes do in discourse. So that sounds scary, but like what you're trying to do is sometimes harder than that. So, yeah.
We are at time, so thank you all so much for being here, and let's thank our presenters one more.